Cold evening, but it's a good way to spend a late winter evening here. I am Troy Osborne. I'm the Dean of Conrad Grebel University College. On behalf of the college, on behalf of the Institute of Anabaptist and Mennonite Studies, it is my pleasure to welcome all of you to this evening's lecture by Professor Leonard Friesen. I wish to acknowledge at the beginning here that Conrad Grebel is located on the traditional territory of the Attawandaron, the Anishinaabe, and the Haudenosaunee peoples. The college and the University of Waterloo were built on the Haldimand Tract. This is land given in treaty in 1874 to the Six Nations. It includes 6 kilometers on each side of the Grand River, from its source in Dundalk Township to its mouth at Lake Erie. Mennonites were the first permanent white settlers in the area we now know today as Waterloo Region. 1805, Mennonites from Pennsylvania purchased 60,000 acres of land, Block 2 of the Haldimand Tract, in present-day Kitchener-Waterloo. This land was given in treaty to support the Six Nations, but this did not happen. So Grebel's work at reconciliation with Indigenous peoples includes decolonizing our historical narratives, our minds, and our hearts, which is an ongoing process. We have a long way to go, but we do this in humility and in gratitude to our Indigenous neighbors, past and present. Just a few sort of orienting comments tonight before we begin, and then I'll just get straight to the introduction and invite Dr. Friesen to come to the front here. We have washrooms on this floor here, but I do want to note there are accessible washrooms on the second floor. You can take the elevator and go up there. There are also gender-neutral washrooms up there too. I'd like to thank Maria Smirnova. I don't see Maria here. Maybe she's still in the hallway, who was very helpful in setting up the logistics for tonight, and to Zena for running the sound for us tonight. So thank you to the work that goes into that. I would also like to invite everyone here to tomorrow evening, where there'll be a second lecture by Dr. Friesen, and this one will have a reception afterwards. So there'll be food and treats. And so if there's any more incentive you need, I invite you to come tomorrow. Following tonight's lecture, though, there won't be a reception, but you're welcome to stay and talk. Leonard clearly enjoys seeing people who are here and talking to them, and I'm sure he'd like a chance to say hello, but do come back tomorrow. There'll be a short Q&A after the formal presentation, and I'll take answers with a microphone at that time. So Professor Leonard Friesen was born in Niagara Peninsula to an immigrant community of Mennonites. He received his PhD from the University of Toronto in 1989 after graduate studies in the USSR. Len's research focuses on Soviet and Russian history, Fedor Dostoevsky, and you can see some of that research will definitely come through this evening. He teaches at Wilfrid Laurier, where he has been recognized with several awards over the years, and I just learned this afternoon that he will be retiring on July 1 this summer, so congratulations on that landmark. Now, this is, as I said, this presentation comes out of his new book, Mennonites in the Russian Empire and the Soviet Union Through Much Tribulation, which is published by the University of Toronto Press. It's a comprehensive history. It'll take you from late medieval origins of Anabaptism to the very modern world of the Soviet Union and its collapse. Len looks at Mennonite history through the rise of modernity. It's an ambitious project that he accomplished with lively prose and very nicely nuanced analysis. If you have more than a passing interest in tonight's lectures, I'd really encourage you to find a copy of it and read it for yourself. So Leonard told me he prefers a brief introduction. In that spirit, let's welcome Leonard Friesen tonight.
Thanks, Troy. Good evening. Thank you for coming. I'm appreciative of the invitation from Grebel. I first discovered Grebel when there was one building here, fall of 1975. There are 3 other people at least here this evening who were part of that class. It was magic at that time, and that's one of the great memories I have of coming here. And when I stand on here, I think the last time I stood here is when I lectured in PAX 201. I'm confident none of my students from that year are here this evening. I always think you should send a letter of an apology to when you start lecturing. And that's the only time I thought I actually knew anything. And so I'm grateful to Marcus and to Troy for the invitation to come and speak here at this place especially. And I have 2 different lectures, and I just want to say at the outset that, so I'm going to be talking about things like Ukraine and Russia. And these are matters of a great deal of controversy, and I am not neutral on my view of a war that I think we wanted, and we wanted it there, and we wanted it with Russia there. So that's, I don't think that in a very light way. And I apologize if my views about the national question, because it relates directly to Mennonites, are they Ukrainian Mennonites or Russian Mennonites, offends you. And if it's any comfort, I generally assume I'm wrong in what I think about anything, and you're welcome to think that as well. I can't, and I'll talk for 60 minutes max. If you would know my father, you would understand the fear of speaking 1 moment longer. And that won't happen. I can't believe it's the only reference to Lenin I'll make in this lecture. That seems somehow dishonest. I want to begin by giving a disclaimer, and that is I really, until recently, did not think of myself at all as a Mennonite historian. And I have a hunch after 2 lectures, that'll be the feedback you get to Troy and Marcus as well. And it has to do with the fact that I've spoken, say, a bazillion times in public settings in the, over the last, well, for 30 years. And the first time I ever spoke on Mennonites in those 30 years was for the Historical Society of Ontario, and I want to acknowledge that was actually kind of terrifying for me to actually talk about Mennonites. And then if that wasn't enough, I want to acknowledge the Mennonite Heritage Museum in Abbotsford, which I'd never been to, really quite remarkable with Richard Thiessen. Gave me an opportunity to further think about Mennonites, and I found that helpful, and so you're getting the fruit of that. And so that's really what I want to go through. I want to say very briefly, in terms of slides, my own background. That's what I understood about my past growing up. Like nothing, it was not talked about. My grandmother lived with us also. We were a refugee family. But my mom would get nightmares if she talked about it. She was born in 1929 in Soviet Ukraine. This is what it felt like to study Soviet studies in the 80s. It was a cool thing. No one ever asked why, and it was because it was the study of evil. It's the remarkable thing about my career that I started it and have ended it in a world in which Russia was evil, Soviet Union was evil. Wasn't true then, isn't true now. But it is indeed the narrative that's there. And part of it was living in that country. And I've been to Ukraine and Russia maybe 30 times each. Haven't been there since COVID. This is a picture of Mary and me with actually 2.5 children. And it's remarkable that this evening, all 4 of us, now 5, are here. From that photo. That especially has an enormous influence on what I'm going to say tomorrow about the Soviet Union, was living there, and it affected my whole generation of scholars. What drew me to Mennonite studies was actually because my first book, which I thought dealt a lot with Mennonites, second book on rural revolutions in Ukraine, dealt with Mennonites as part of that larger world, and it brought me often back to working in places, and forgive me, I speak in the language that it was called when I was most actively working there in Dnipropetrovsk, Zaporozhye, and Odessa. And I met young scholars who surprisingly were interested in Mennonites, which I wasn't working on, and they were working mainly, as most Ukrainian scholars were at the time, in Russian. And so I translated their work, and I ghost wrote a number of the chapters, at least half of them, because they didn't understand, they knew the archives, but they didn't understand the story of Mennonites. And out of that, the publisher, University of Toronto Press, and Stephen Shapiro, urged me to think about writing a history that would actually connect the dots about Mennonites. And I always say, and it's only half a joke, that I only decided to do it when I realized no one good was going to. And then that ended up becoming me. And this is what has struck me about the way in which we've approached Mennonite history. And that is, we've tended to put them somewhere on the moon with respect to the world around them. It's as if that world somehow didn't exist, or if it existed, it barely did, and they were all separate, don't you know, And there are real implications for our understanding of that history rather than seeing them as an integral part of the region they're part of. And so the story I wanted to tell in that most recent book was really trying to put them within that larger world, because that's how they understood themselves. I don't have a doubt in the world about it. What I want to do tomorrow is I want to talk about what are the most remarkable of Mennonites for me, which is that Soviet generation, the one we ignore. We tend to ignore their story. And what's remarkable is the strength of courage they show around matters of faith. And that's this very specific question in the time of Stalin. A weird world in which Stalin opens up possibilities of religion, even when it's illegal, and Khrushchev, the guy we like, tries to close them down. So I want to look at that. And this evening, what I want to take a look at is the start of the Mennonite experience in the Russian or Ukrainian lands. And already when I use that language, you understand how provocative it is. And that's just the way it is. So I wanted to start with three pictures. Those are random a Mennonite family I got from the web. If you're closely related to them, I believe Marcus has a free Tupperware set for you. Just go immediately to Marcus after the lecture. By the way, I have glasses, and I'm not wearing them. I'm just not comfortable when I'm lecturing. So if you want to make some sort of a rude gesture from the back, if you would ask me first to put on my glasses, it'll be more effective. So you have a kind of Mennonite world. You've got your basic peasants, whatever. And you've got a monument that I think is the most remarkable of the monuments that I associate with Harvey Dick. And that is the one at Eichenfeld. I'm curious how many people here have seen that monument with their own eyes. There will be some of you that have gone on the famous boat tour and gone these ways. It's a remarkable monument to the massacre in Eichenfeld in 1919 by someone named Nestor Makhno, working with other peasants, local and more distant. And I think when we put these pictures together, so I think those are the pictures in which we tell the Mennonite story. That it has to do with Mennonites who look kind of far too fancy, peasants, and we understand these in a flat way. They're like that, all of them. Peasants are all the same, right? And that's where you end up. That these people are out of touch with their world. They don't connect to their world. And as a result, as bad as the revolution is, which is 1917, as bad as it is, they kind of had it coming to them. And that relates to the assumptions we make. So I have a number of assumptions, and that's really what I want to do is waltz through these this evening. First, that Mennonites took away indigenous land. That is a hot-button issue in Canada. And when you apply it here, we assume indigenous Ukrainians, because those lands will now be in Russia. You could say Ukrainian Russians, whatever. But that's what they did. They took land away from indigenous peoples. We transfer that understanding that Troy began with. Second, their wealth alienated them from the beginning from their neighbors. Third, they also had an unfair advantage. They had way too many things and they got privileges, which they did, and that they were unfair, and therefore there was already tension within the emerging society because of it. The fact that they spoke German, they first spoke Dutch, and after that they shifted to German. Chortica, more Dutch initially. Malochna, this is like, and if those words don't mean anything, Chortica, Malochna, you have lived a charmed life, is all that I would say about that, followed by GC and MB. That Mennonites removed themselves from state and society was that. And as tough as it sounds, because of all of that, they got what they deserved in 1917. Well, and I want to look at all of those, and I think none of those are true. And I don't think they're true by not just a little bit, they're just wrong. And I want to sort of try to work through them. And we'll see how I do. Well, the easy part is, and I can't go further, and Ishmael will tell me, how am I doing so far in terms of where I stand? Oh, perfect. Of course, I couldn't see a signal. We're looking at Khortytsa as the first settlement. They settle in, I think that was around 150,000 acres. And then Molochnas. I can't go there because I'm off the camera, but you see where I mean. And the issue is really, when it comes to, say, in taking land away, is Khortytsa, which is there. And that's because that's a land of Zaporozhian Cossacks. And then we assume from that the Cossacks were indigenous. I won't bother to read all of these because I don't take notes. I have to have slides like this, and then I just know what I have to make up, which is the stuff not on the slides. And so this is the decree by Catherine the Great in 1775. Mennonites show up in 1789, which disbands the Zaporozhian Cossacks. And I want to come back to this question of, can we call the Cossacks indigenous? Did they have some sort of, whatever we understand by that word, it has a particular ideological meaning in our society. And what happens to these Cossacks is a variety of things. They're formally disbanded. They're moved over to the Kuban. Others, the elite, they have a rotating elite. The elites are brought into Russian nobility, Imperial Russian nobility. There are no Russians. There are no Ukrainians in 1800. These are categories that are invented by 1900 or so, later. And others are shipped east. And the land itself is given to Prince Pochomkin. Pochomkin, who is the viceroy, the Uber boss in overseeing the settlement of that region. All of this under Catherine the Great. And you have the Great Expansion. Peter the Great gets all the press clippings, but actually accomplished very little in terms of expansion. But Catherine really does some big things in moving, and really under Catherine, 1783 with Crimea, takes control of that whole region. And Mennonites who find themselves in the Danzig area are closed out at that point, that very point with Prussia. What we don't often acknowledge is the only reason Prussia is able to close out Mennonites in Poland is because it works with the Russian Empire, which really wants the destruction of Poland. It wants the absorption of Poland, and it's successful with that. And the lion's share of what happens to the former Polish Commonwealth goes to the Russian Empire. It's really a great deal land. So the Mennonites are gone from a place, and then what did Mother Abbess in Sound of Music say? When God closes a door, a window opens. I forget, it's something. It was the first 7 movies I could see. You'd think I'd know. But that's what happens with the Mennonites. So did the Mennonites take indigenous land from Ukrainian Cossacks? Were Cossacks Ukrainian? And did they get an unfair advantage, or was Ukrainian even a category in 1800? Was Russian a category in 1800? Well, there are a host of problems with this question, and the bottom line is these were categories that did not exist in 1800. These are categories that came upon later, and even when you have them, and I understand that the Ukrainian state has claimed the Cossacks, but that is a weird thing if you understand the history of the Cossacks, and I'll get to that. It's worth noting that the Ottoman Empire had formal control of the Black Sea lands, and it did until Catherine. That was where Peter was really unsuccessful. He wanted to build St. Petersburg down there, but failed, so he ended up with the Swedes. But the land is there. This is a map of Kiev, of Ukraine, the way it was, and the capital of Kiev right here, right? I'm curious if people have been to Kiev. It's just interesting for me. So if you've been to Kiev, and at the end of Ulica Kreshchatyk, which is the main drag, you go up to the monument of the Fellowship of Russia and Ukraine. It's surely been destroyed by now. And you're up on a high cliff. You're up on a high cliff because Kiev was put there because it was the last safe place before the prairie started. And the prairie was a place of danger. And the danger was that Slavs, which is what they were would make their way across the prairie zone because the mothership Constantinople, I remember I'd been lecturing for years before someone said to me, but sir, isn't it called Istanbul now? The way they would get there was to cross that zone. So I only say that because if you would use the measurement we use of indigeneity, Ukraine would immediately have to vacate about 80% of its land. Anything south of Kiev was clearly not where the Slavs were. They were in the hills, they were in the forested area. Makes it really hard on that basis alone to see the Cossacks as anything, but we haven't talked about the Cossacks. It was a nomadic steppe. There's a great traveler, I think a German traveler of the 1840s, who talks about a calf could be raised by the Carpathians and eat its way to the Pacific Ocean. There was just nothing stopping it. So when the Mongols come, the Urals are actually quite low. They're quite small, and they don't go all the way down. It was a land of nomadic peoples. Eventually, the Mongol horde, Genghis Khan, his grandson, who initiated that, it split up, and you had all of these hordes that emerged out of it, including a certain settlements in Crimea. They were not nomadic. It's like you kept bumping into water. So they become actually sedentary. Bad things will happen to them in the 30s. And the north, it says Crimean, but it was actually Nogai Tatars, Nogai. And they were nomadic Tatars. And they were the ones who were actually, if you were looking at indigeneity, one could argue were, even though they were one of a series of nomadic peoples. Well, who are the Cossacks? Who the Cossacks were had to do with how the Russian state expanded. So the Russian state and the Polish state wanted control of its populations. People wanted to be free. And so what people did constantly was move to the frontiers. And that movement to the frontiers, which, by the way, then the Polish state and the Imperial, and then not Imperial Russia, and the Muscovite state, both wanted control of those populations. And in a way, you could understand the expansion of the Muscovite state as coming to try to gain a population that forever was moving faster than it should have been. You also understand why Poland and Imperial Russia were like this by the 18th century. So that's where you had the Cossacks, and the Cossacks of interest to Mennonites were the ones just before the rapids. And the word in Russian, Ukrainian, my Ukrainian is very limited. Everyone spoke Russian before the war. Who knows what it will be like after, who knows. But was Zaporozhye. Zaporozhye is after behind the rapids. And that's where, and then Stalin, they build this lovely dam which wipes out Kathy's parents' home village, if I have that right, of Schoenhorst? Rechivka. But what was the Menno name? The Mennonite name? Schoenhorst, yeah, Schoenhorst. But what I want to say about it, so the Cossacks are on the periphery, on the Kuban, on the Volga, and what they are Slavs getting away. Slavic people. Slav comes from slave. They had been enslaved by the Ottoman Empire, other forces. And they're moving into this area. And this map is a fiction that emerges. And I get it, having to create Ukrainian political entities. But that never existed. You see the clear boundary? And it didn't exist because the Cossacks lived in the river valleys. That's Khotitsa. And the nomadic peoples controlled the prairie. And it was a constant dance. The newcomers were the Cossacks, without a doubt. And what they did was sell their services back and forth to the Poles, to Muscovites. And eventually, when Moscow won that struggle, and when Catherine gained control of this whole area, she no longer needed them. And that's when they shoved them over somewhere else. I don't want to spend a lot of time on this, but these are books that influenced me in terms of thinking about peasant identities. They did not think about Russian. They did not think about peasant. These were muddy categories. A great professor of mine at University of Toronto, John L.H. Keep, begins his book on Russian Revolution by saying, if you asked a peasant where they were from, they would say, "Мы здешние." We're from around here. мы здешние. They did not have a sense that they were part of, anyway, 4 time zones, whenever you get the time zones, and they're from around here. And I have countless examples of how identities were fiercely localized. Makhno is an excellent example of someone who had no Ukrainian nationalist aspirations. He would have killed anyone in a suit. That's what I would say to students. Didn't care if they were from Kiev, Moscow, St. Petersburg, did not care. He had a localized identity. And that's what peasants had. And all identities, I could talk about these. I'll talk about Kate Brown tomorrow, a fabulous study. All of these talk about how identities form really in 1900 through the education system. Peasants into Frenchmen, the oldest of the books, which argues that in the 1850s, peasant bureaucrats, French bureaucrats left Paris by horse for 1 day's journey and couldn't understand the language being spoken. These identities are our imposition on this land. The land itself was divided into 3 provinces. The yellow was Khortytsa, Molochna was Tavrida, so the main Mennonite settlements were 2 of those, and the whole thing was called New Russia. And so this became the localized place for Mennonites, but there are 2 countries that did not appear on any real map of the empire in 1900 that did not exist. One country was Russia, and the other country was Ukraine. And that's what makes it very difficult to say, oh, you should call them Ukrainian Mennonites or Russian. We live in an age of where we say there is, what's it called, I get to choose. I can't think of the word. There's a phrase for it. We all get to declare our own identity. Mennonites, if you ask them, called themselves Russian. Russlands Mennoniten. That's what they called themselves. And it doesn't mean they didn't understand that they understood a Ukrainian to be a dialect, Little Russian. It's a complicated question of that relationship. Well, I don't want to say more about that, but I do now want to talk about the settlement. I think the tendency we have to tell the Mennonite story is to see you've got peasants, like about 1 billion of them, they're all the same, God knows, and then you've also got Mennonites. And immediately you have a kind of little kind of, and there was actually remarkable diversity in the settlement of that region. And it relates directly to what I'm going to say about privileges. There were massive estates granted by the state because it wanted to settle that area. All around Khortytsa were massive estates. If you don't know anything about this history, well, how grand, and if you do, great. But if you know about daughter colonies and these other colonies they build, they're all kind of in this northern zone because when the boundaries are unstable, the estate owners want to stay north. And that means I can talk about this in the questions, a lot of that land will become available and Mennonites will scoop it up. That's when relations start to go bad in the 1880s, 1890s. I'll just make passing reference to it. There may be a question about it. There are large state peasant villages. 60% of the peasants in the south did not have a landlord. So our image of I'll call it southern Ukraine, New Russia. It was called New Russia. No one called it southern Ukraine. Nobody. New Russia is that they're all kind of, the antebellum U.S. black plantation is a bad parallel. It does not make the parallel. 60% had no landlords. They were peasants of the state, and those were massive villages. They were 1,000 plus by the 1880s and 1870s. Gulai Polye, which is the village of Makhno, over 1,000. So if he wanted an army, it didn't take long to get one. And he was in the north, and I can talk something about. By the way, the Makhno village, Mary knows every time I talk, I learned something new, and I looked that up over supper, founded, as I thought it would, 1770. So Makhno had the same claim to, I'll say, indigeneity, his village, as the Mennonites did. I guess 10 years earlier. Massive villages. These estates, by the way, had very few serfs, and I'll come back to that. And then you had massive land grants to European colonists. So we know about Mennonites, but there were also Catholics, German Lutherans. By the way, the Imperial Russian state kept those categories separately. Mennonites were Mennonite, they weren't German Lutherans, they weren't German Catholics. Those were, you had three categories, and going to church was irrelevant, and it drove the Russian state crazy when Mennonites developed, like the MB split actually, or the Kleine Gemeinde, any religious split, because for them it was a legal category. Religion was irrelevant to that whole discussion. But the Swedes have colonies, the Bulgarians, the Greeks, the Serbs. It's a massive land. It's not Mennonites kind of in isolation and living on the edge of people who've been there forever, and suddenly you have the new kind. Molochna, they end up settling all sorts of Russian sectarians. Why not put all the weirdos together? And so they end up with Dukhobors. Dukhobor is Dukhobortsi, the Russian spirit wrestlers. Molokans. Molokans are another kind of Protestant sect that emerges. That the name would same with Molochna, milk, Molochna, moloko, and so forth. So you have enormous diversity, and Jews were allowed. The Tatars were also part of this, the Nagai Tatars, and I'll talk about that in a bit. There were peasants who were, their job, when the rapids were there, lotsmen, was just to guide the boats through the rapids. That was their gig. I remember I was there once at Dnipropetrovsk early on. I met this scholar named Sergei Palkhy when he was still there. Greatest mind in Ukrainian history, now at Harvard. It's always a funny story I tell, that I used to write him all sorts of letters of reference, couldn't get him a job, and then finally he landed one at a small American school called Harvard. And a brilliant career. He's really annoying how much he publishes. But we went to Gamburg, I went with a couple of his grad students, Hamburg. And these are villages that were devoted to fishing. Much more diverse than we've ever allowed ourselves. There were military settlements, and Guliapol was one of them, where they established, they had the harebrained idea that they'd farm wearing uniforms. That worked for about a week and a half. But they established many of these things as well. And that's how these identities began to emerge. And so for us to see Mennonites in isolation, they're part of a fascinating world of enormous diversity. It's there in terms of social and economic ways. I can't see what time it is. 8:05. Okay, I can't remember when I started. I have problems. I don't remember. Okay, how much time do I have left, Mary? 15. Oh my word. Okay. Privileges. Mennonites got privileges. They did get 25. Yeah. I have no time for jokes. My favorite sign that I ever saw at a student residence, I was walking by, and I try never to look at a student residence window, but I was drawn to a sign, and the sign said, "There are three kinds of people in this world, those who are good with numbers and those who aren't." I quite like that sign, so somewhere we would fit within that. Mennonites did get privileges all the time. But here's the deal, people. There was no notion of a citizen in the Russian Empire. I'm told the Polish, I like to just, 1/6 of the world landmass is enough for me to try to master. So I won't talk about the Poles, but the Mennonites start getting privilegium in not Poland, Kingdom Poland, because they're not citizens. They don't fit into a slot, Christianin. And there was that omnibus term, although the state peasants and the serfs were classed differently. But that's because they did not fit within any rubric. And so the state had no way to deal with them beyond a specific contract. It's not that they could fit in as a citizen of the empire. That category only exists in 1870s and 1880s, when they will abolish those different kind of peasant categories. I've seen those archival records. Then they'll refer to them as former state peasants, former serfs. But they begin to develop a notion of states, and Mennonites, well, among other things, they'll lose then immediately military exemption. The reason they got military exemption is you didn't want unbelievers, we would call them Protestants, unbelievers, polluting the army. And by the way, the average draft, I think in 1800, was for 49 years. When you left the village, you got a funeral service, which would have been discouraging, if you think about it. Mennonites didn't fit in that, and you had to negotiate all categories. And so Mennonites negotiated privilegia because there was no other way to exist within that empire. And they got relatively large amounts of land. But the true, and they got lots of land because their reputation as agriculturalists, even though they botch agriculture when they first get there. But the truth is, the Russian Empire waived any idea of serfdom to settle the area. And I've seen numerous complaints by nobility who say, my serfs are running away, because it wanted just to settle the South. By settling the South, it was creating a barrier of sorts, right? And so the Russian state actually created enormous possibilities. There's scads of land for the settlers in 1800. Peasants tended to get by allotment as much as they could farm in a day. As much, if you think of, there are not 1,000 households in 1800. These are massive areas. Land is not an issue till mid-century and later. And there are reasons why Mennonites then will do better. I'll just say something about the Donbass, and it has to do with those rocks. I love all this rocks and this pillaging that's now happening to Ukraine. It's a horrible war, a horrible, utterly unavoidable war. Totally. It's just horrible. The diversity and so forth. Donbass is because there's all this rocks. I'll come back to it. That's a reason not to leave early. I'll just point out Lenin. I thought I didn't have another Lenin, but there's my friend. When he writes his classic work in the late 1880s, Развитие капитализма в России, the development of capitalism in Russia, he mainly writes about the area around the Mennonites, because it's an area of intense agricultural development and an area of remarkable diversity. And in the 1870s, there are all these studies that come out, which Lenin borrows from, which, by the way, for the book I wrote, if I didn't have strong historians and memoirs doing all the work for me to write, Troy will know what I mean, with his wonderful study of the really big picture. I want to be really clear. I have such respect for so many scholars, so many people who told their own truth. That's the phrase I was looking for. Who wrote their memoirs. I see Vic, and I think of his, it's your grandfather, writing about a remarkable work. I'll talk about it tomorrow a little bit. So you have this diversity that works in all of this. Well, the Mennonites want to settle along the water. They're not able to, and I'll just move through this really quickly. And they're not able to because it's not secure. They want to be along the water because that's where towns are set to be developed, including the town being obliterated. Here we are in real time. Kherson had an overnight that was memorable in Kherson. I won't go into it now. And on my way once from Zaporozhye to Odessa. And all of this privilegia, by the way, they didn't get half the stuff the state promised. If you've been to Russia or Ukraine, none of that will surprise you, that things don't happen the way you're told. And instead, they're stuck up by the land of the Zaporozhian Cossacks. They don't want it, but Potyomkin orders them there because it's one of his estates. And he wants to put them there as a kind of showpiece. And do Mennonites have initially the Midas touch? Well, they don't. They don't want to be there. They're not farmers. They're overwhelmingly involved in non-agricultural. They're in tradesmen. They tend to be the poorest, which is why they could get out of the Prussian lands. The land is dreadful. If you've been to, I always call it Mennoville because Zaporozhye is too hard. But if you've ever been to Mennoville, you'll know Chotitsa, it's these kind of deep kind of cuts. And you made a choice, the Mennonites did, whether to settle down or up, whether to settle I was going to take my jacket off, but I feel like it's like an ensemble. I have to now, only this one. Okay, I don't know. Stop the clock. I don't have a good feeling about any of this. Here, and then, okay. I think we're okay. Thank you. I'm getting older and I don't care, and it's so funny. When you get to be a certain age, you think, fine, if you're still wearing something, then it can't be that bad. They don't get the lumber they want. Their first houses are earthen, and they struggle mightily. And the state even realizes they got to give them better land. It's ironic with all of the language, and I can talk about this in the break, is Mennonites will eventually make a lot of money from those rocks. The very rocks that are now in the press every day. Mennonites will be right between the ones that will end up in Russia and the others that may end up in Russia, which is where Zelensky's from, Krivoy Rih, iron ore. And the Mennonites will make a lot of money from that stuff. Well, Molochna, the empire realizes it needs to do something better. They get much better land. And indigeneity, one can make an argument that the Molochna takes it away because you have Nogai Tatars there. And the Tatars are nomadic, and then the Mennonites will move in along with Ukrainians and Russians. By the way, Ukrainian peasants will be, such as they exist, or Russian, are thrilled with the end of the Zaporozhian Sich because it allows them to settle and move further south also. The neat thing about studying the past is it's not what you expect. It's just so amazing when you realize that. Their settlers are wealthier, they'll do better. And it's settled along Great Chumaki line. Chumak were the great peasant carters. There's a painting I really like, I'll never see it again, in Yekaterinburg in the Urals, where I was several times connected to Laurier. And it's of these Chumakis, and that's why if you've been to Molochna, these broad avenues, they were built so oxen could graze their way across the steppe. They're also more Germanized, they're wealthier, and so that will do actually better. Well, that's enough to kind of tell you what I hope will show the rich diversity of that land. Just incredibly diverse in a host of ways. Did they have bad relations with their neighbors? Well, the answer is no. I just don't see any reason to believe it until the 1870s and 1880s, and then it's particular to where Machno's up, which is these more recent settlements. And I'll maybe talk about that, or that can come in the questions. For one thing, they settle at the same time. They do not settle later. Krivoy Rih is later than Molochna because it's further north. Sorry, not Krivoy Rih, Gulay Pol. As the settlement moves south, Mennonites settle at the very same time. They develop, and there's no evidence of poor relations, again, at the beginning. What's the Mennonite word for water, the Russian-Ukrainian word for watermelon? Arbuz. Where does the word arbuz, what language is that? Dum, 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 dum. The Turkish. It's a Turkish word. So it's a really interesting thing, right? Just arbuz. I think I know what Rokuchen means. But arbuz tells you that, and it's a step in which Molochna is a dry land, as opposed to Khotitsa, you've got the Dnieper River. And so you have to get water somewhere, and you get water through bashtan, which are watermelon fields. And so Mennonites learn from locals, and that learning goes in all sorts of directions. I thought of a reference that brought me to Grebel's wonderful library last week. I do want to acknowledge Lorene letting me work illegally during COVID in the library with gratitude when I needed to track some things down. But I read Gerhard Lorenz's book, Memoir. It's an example of why memoirs are so rich. So he's in one of these daughter colonies, and one of the things he writes on, page 78, is that they grew a lot of watermelon. They would have learned it from Molochna, almost certainly. And they used to sell all those watermelon to the local peasants, but eventually that stopped because the peasants learned how to grow watermelon. And part of what we have is a view of peasants as kind of stupid, And we really do have that prejudice, and people would say, studying indigenous peoples, there would be the same prejudice that would be there. Peasants were not stupid, and that relates to the next 2 points I want to make. Mennonites, when they figure out what to do with rocks, and they build one of the same first railroads, it goes right through Alexandrovsk, which becomes Zaporozhye, and there's Shoinviz as the only Mennonite settlement there. Mennonites start, like they sell vast numbers of agricultural implements. I think they have 10% of the empire's business. These aren't small producers. Well, what do Mennonites do with their old, when they develop a new kind of self-binding reaper? What do? They sell it. They sell it to local peasants. And peasants who are not stupid, ever, they work to change they buy these things. They learn how to repair these things because they can either take them to the Mennos or, like Gerhard Lorenz find out, learn themselves. So what do you find then around cast-offs? They move them on. What do you find about grain yields? And I've looked at these numbers. The grain yields of peasants are richer in rings around the Mennonite settlements. Not the daughter colonies. There's a problem with those that I can talk about. And the last thing I'll say about the kind of comparison is if you look at 1905, and my life just then went another direction. Bob Johnson, a colleague at Toronto, well, it used to be at Tobacco, it's got some other name now, I don't know, it doesn't matter. Once said I should follow through and look at the other, and somehow life intervened. So I didn't get to 1917 in detail, but 1905 revolution, I did look at the archival records. There's just no evidence of going after Mennonites at a point at which there is, in 1905 is like it's like a dress rehearsal for 1917, the big revolution. And there's just no evidence of Mennonites being singled out. And by 1905, there is no interest in the state in being nice to Mennonites. None. There's just no evidence they're being singled out. Again, relations change beyond that. Are Mennonites not isolated in villages? And I won't say much about this, but they're not, unless you want to say everybody's isolated in their villages. But Mennonites early on worked the markets, as did peasants, by the way. And I know this because I looked at it. You put a train station anywhere in this, and they put them all in the 70s and 80s, especially 90s. The first thing peasants do is develop intensive market gardening around those train stations. We miss peasants in all of this by seeing them only as kind of helpless, and then there are too many stereotypes to mention. Mennonites are peasants are intimately connected to the world market. And I could talk at length about sheep breeds that peasants have to adapt to. And it had to do with the US Civil War. It had to do with the development of Australia and New Zealand sheep breeding, the shift from wool to cotton. Mennonites are involved in world fare on behalf of the empire. I saw a recent article on that. They pick up on all sorts of music. All the songs in my background that we think of Mennonite are not Mennonite songs, of course. They're pietistic songs that they cribbed from the Lutherans. Lutherans again. Ich bete an die Macht der Liebe, and I love this idea, we were going to sing a Mennonite song. Yes. Oh, Power of Love? All love transcending. Thank you. Which, of course, is kind of like the title. They're reading newspapers. This is a blurry copy of the Odessa Zeitung. And these papers are full of larger events. They're paying attention to these events. They need to pay attention. Those that had to move freely did. David Rempel, who had such a profound influence on the start of my career, grateful to David Rempel. His memoir is quite remarkable because it talks about his father was a grain trader, and talked about the easy move, and he hired both poor Mennonites and local peasants, Ukrainians, peasants, whatever. And he talks about the ease with which they would move. A new book on Corney's looks at how peasants would come to Johann Corney's father, who was a bit of a faith healer. And you look at the list of people who would come. People found those connections. Did everyone travel everywhere and make it to Vegas or wherever? No. But were they, as a people, disconnected from that empire? Not by a long shot. didn't the reliance on German affect their integration? That's, this is one of the things we say. They were outsiders culturally. So the first question I have is this guy sitting here. I always styled my beard on him when I was initially married. Between that and a convict, but there's Mary still. It's amazing. Is Alexander Herzen a Russian noble? Did he speak Russian? Well, not really. Badly. All nobles really didn't speak Russian. How could they? They had It was a primitive language. If I could tell you, in Ukraine, the number of times I heard Ukrainian, I don't support this view, say that Russian was a more cultured language. There's a certain educational, where you learn that, right? You learn this, that there's something that's kind of more superior. I'm not for a moment think that's the case. But the number of times I heard that in the last 30 years. Russian was considered a primitive language. Catherine the Great, she was a German princess ruling a Russian empire, a Russian Orthodox. What was her language of correspondence? French. It was French. Nicholas and Alexandra's language, the last Tsar of Russia, he was a Russian nationalist. He's given a bad press. And his dad, Alex, they wrote in English to each other. I mean, she was the granddaughter of, they were both sort of connected to Victoria, which explains their son. But with hemophilia, I'm not making light of hemophilia in any way, shape, or form. It explains how closely connected the royal lands were by 1900. I meant that with utter seriousness. I didn't read this book when it came out, because the book was called Scenarios of Power. It sounded, I don't know what. Fabulous book when I finally got to it. And it's about the way in which the imperial symbols of rule, and how did coronations work, and how did funerals work. Fabulous, fabulous study. So you have this from Alexander II. This would have been then in 1856. Does he look more like a peasant or a Mennonite? And the truth of the matter is, it's an empire. It's like the Ottoman Empire. Empires don't come to uniformity. When the empire does in the 1870s and 80s, that's when a notion of Ukrainian nationalism will emerge, in the cities first, and in a very Russian city of Kiev initially. That's where it'll emerge, Lvov and Kiev. These are diverse places, and this is really crucial. Mennonites governed themselves because the empire, we can't imagine, was short on bureaucrats. Mark Ryeff is the historian who really did this study, and Mark Ryeff is the one who looked at the number of bureaucrats in the empire, and they were undergoverned. So if you're undergoverned, how do you organize your empire? And the way you organized your empire, Paul Wirth's recent study on the Tsar's foreign faiths, was by your faith. I said earlier, German Lutherans were a category. You needed them to govern themselves because you couldn't do it. You needed Mennonites to govern themselves. It was not a sign of separation. It was in governing themselves that they demonstrated themselves to be part of the empire. And even what national meant, like for the 1800, 1820, 1830, to be a nationalist, because this was what Nicholas I begins to use, is not to be kind of a Russian, because that doesn't exist. It's to be a Petrovian. It's to be a follower. It's to be loyal to the monarch. And so Peter the Great and Mennonites were fervently loyal to the monarchy. The residue of that nationally is, it's hard to pick the weirdest national anthem, but it's surely to goodness the British. It's not God Save England, it's God Save the King. Loyalty to the king, that's why that's an old anthem, right? That's how the empire operated. The nationality, the language was irrelevant till the 1870s and 80s. And how much time do I have? Okay. Everything changes in the 1870s. Quickly read this. Good. I can come back to it. So all of this, and I want to say one thing, and then I have one more slide after this. So the last question is, did they deserve what they got? You know, historians are groupies. In a lot of ways, we all follow the same trend. It won't be shocking that a dominant area of history right now is personal identity, sexual identity. Anyone shocked about that? Wouldn't think so. We all follow trends and we move on them. Historians all argued for decades that the Russian Revolution was inevitable. Why? Because it happened. After 1991, that all fell apart. Why? Because it all fell apart. The example I would always give to my students is that Billy and Bobby are together. They're madly in love. They get married. You ask them about their relationship, and they both say, you know, the first time we saw each other's eyes, and we knew it was love, and there was this look he gave, and right? We know what that's like. And then Billy and Betty, was it Billy or Bobby? I don't want to cause even more scandal. It's a Mennonite school, for pity's sake. Whatever it was, they break up, and then you ask them, and they say, you know what? I remember the date where I said, return the library book or turn left, and they said, no. Like, no. We all know this. And so historians have simply dropped the idea of the inevitability of that revolution. It's like almost nobody now would argue it. It's just really strange. My friend Wayne Dowler's book, Russia in 1913, argues, but for a very bad war, this should have been a cautionary tale to at least one country I'm thinking of right now. Except for a very bad war, the Russian Empire would have still existed. It was remarkably stable. The point I want to make is our notion of the inevitability of Mennonites getting what they deserve will not fly with what the larger historiography, the larger work of historians are now arguing. And if the revolution was not inevitable, the one thing you can't argue is that somehow Mennonites in it got what they deserved. So, in conclusion, Fred's words always, the words in conclusion always generate profound enthusiasm after a presentation. You know, when you teach people who are more interested in dating for a living, you just have to desperately try to hold their attention. If I had self-worth, I wouldn't. You know, that's the thing. But here are my conclusions. The conclusions I have is that Mennonites plus Ukrainians, Russians, all benefited from Catherine's settlement strategy for New Russia, in quotations, as the area was known, once it was conquered. First. Second, Mennonite colonists had good relations with their Ukrainian, Russian neighbors from the beginning. I'm using Ukrainian and Russian. I would feel much more comfortable saying Slavic neighbors. But you get what I'm saying. Third, Mennonite use of German did not initially alienate them from state or society. It will alienate them not from peasants, but from the state in the 1870s and 80s with the father of the last Tsar. That kind of regime. And I can say more about that in the questions. Fourth, Mennonites did not initially have the Midas touch, and they did have privileges, but that has to be understood as there was no other way for them to get a foothold in the empire. And last, as Mennonites rethink 1917, 1917 is the Russian revolutions, are the Russian revolutions. As Mennonites rethink it and no longer argue it's inevitable, it's really difficult to argue that somehow Mennonites got the fate that they deserved. And those are my comments, and I welcome your questions. I'll even put on my glasses.
Okay. Thank you so much.
Oh, you're here.
Yeah. And thank you, Mary, for your timekeeping. It was a tour de force. I learned questions I didn't know I had and answers to those questions. So it's great. So we do have an opportunity here to ask follow-up questions for the benefits of everyone. I do ask that you use the mic that I'll go around here. So just raise your hand and we will go ahead. Yep.
Thank you. I really appreciated the lecture. You said that Mennonites were Petrovian. Were they more Petrovian than the peasants or anyone else around them? Was it just a matter of giving to Caesar what is Caesar's, or were they especially Petrovian?
That's a really good question. And there is a literature, and I always think it's one of the benefits I've had because of this career I've had. I've spent more time reading. I didn't read about Mennonites till about 8 years ago, to be honest with you. Nine maybe, in any detail, except when I was teaching at Grebel, most certainly. And it was because I got to teach Mennonite history, which is actually was a thrill when I was here. But so the question of peasants, what I would say is that the Tsar was far away from peasant worlds, and that the muizdeshnia was that peasants were largely not connected in any meaningful way to the monarchy. And where that becomes, it's really difficult to, my whole suggestion is that peasants are remarkably diverse beyond the word. The word, I had a slide and I didn't mention it, the Russian words for peasant, krestyanin, and Christian, christianin, virtually the same word. So the origins of peasant was actually Christian, by which it was pravoslavnia, Orthodox, which it was illegal for peasants to be anything else. That's why Mennonites have Mennonite names in my background. You couldn't proselytize. So I don't want to minimize the diversity of the peasant, but for the most part, peasants are not as loyal. And I'll tell you where the case in point is. The guy who gets that wrong it's the same way as Gorbachev will get everything wrong, everything. But it's Nicholas II. And when Nicholas II creates a parliament in 1906, this is the example that comes to mind, he stacks the first parliament, Duma, which comes from the Russian word to think. And this was a country that thought parliament was full of thoughtfulness. It's just, that's why you study another culture, people. Imagine. But the first kind of Duma, they stacked full of peasants because he assumed they were loyal monarchists. They show up and say, we want land, baby. That's what they want. Their issues are localized issues. But for Mennonites, they do tie their wagon to the monarchy, and they're more informed. When I used to lead all these tours for Tour Imagination, you'd get people, because Alexander II slept in Mennonite homes, dined with Mennonites. Generations later, I would hear that story as someone connected with their family. Very interesting question.
Yep. I'll start here and then I'll work my way over there.
Well, comparatively speaking, this isn't a very intelligent question, but my sister-in-law's father was from Russia, and he was very German-speaking, and he came over when the Mennonites brought these trainloads of people from Russia over here. I forget what year that was, but anyway, he was German. He could speak Pennsylvania Dutch. They were put into one of these old order Mennonite farms when they came over as a place.
Yes.
They had places where we put people. So anyway, he could speak Pennsylvania Dutch, and he learned it in Russia, he said. So I just wonder if you could explain that. He could speak the language of the old order Mennonites that he was living in. First came over from Russia.
So I'm tempted to say he was maybe an early one to try some of the drugs that were recently legalized. And I think all questions are interesting, Ruth. I felt badly as soon as I said it, because then no one will ask a question for fear I'm rating them. And I'm not. I think there are similarities to that language and Low German, but to me they're very separate. They're very separate languages, so I actually can't account for the Pennsylvania German. That's just a very different migratory route.
So he said that there was colonies in Russia where they spoke that. He worked for them.
And it's possible west of Kiev there were other colonies that may have come, and there may have been isolated colonies there. There could well have been, I'm not up on Swiss settlers in the southern Ukraine, because there were settlers from everywhere, colonies. I realize that, but all I'm saying is there were varieties of dialects that existed within southern Ukraine, and there was no single German language. Even that is a myth. And so it's easy to imagine there were various dialects from the German Catholics. I want to get to the south of Germany, and that south of Germany would take me to the Catholics. And I can imagine some of those dialects were similar to the Deutsch.
Who had their hand? Okay.
This question about the Russian language. In 1871, when military conscription was assigned, the schools were also ordered to teach in Russian.
Yes.
But the way you were speaking about Russian language as not being I was wondering about the Ukrainian language, the Russian language. Where is there the separation between the two, or what were they actually taught in the schools?
Russian. And Russian was the lingua franca, was the common language. Zelensky didn't speak Ukrainian when he was elected. He only spoke Russian. He's from Kryvyi Rih. It's a Russian, it's full of Russians. It's only Russian. And so the only language was Russian. And what will happen, what the Russian state does is two things, and they don't go together, and Canada tries to do that as well, is they try to introduce, after Crimea, the Crimean War, they get a new Tsar, is they try to introduce this idea of the, I'll say, modern state, in which you have citizens and you drop these separate categories. They get immediate pushback because the nobles don't think that's a fabulous idea. Mennonites become legally peasants. And so that all is part of the rational of a society. And the other thing the Russian state will do that's contrary to that is develop a national movement. The last two Tsars of Russia have beards. And the beards are not a small thing because the beard signals peasant. And so it is a way in which, like why when you're creating rationalizing would you care if it was Russian or what? Why would you care? But the Russian Empire also launches into a kind of nationalist movement. And Mennonites at that point will be caught in the buzzsaw of Germany, the creation of Germany. And I can say more about that. But the Ukrainian language was controversially not always recognized as a language. And I'm not an expert at all on the development of Ukrainian nationalism, but it emerges most specifically in cities of what I'll call Ukraine. But there was no Ukraine province. But Kiev is central, and it has to do with the development of national identities as it develops everywhere in the late 19th century. But even within Ukrainian peoples, there's a question as to whether it's an actual language. I was invited to write something last week, and the guy who invited me has an award-winning book. I hadn't read it, and I looked it up. And it's called Divided Dynasties, and it's about a Ukrainian family in the late 19th century, elite Ukrainian family. One of the heirs who rejected Ukrainian identity and wanted to stay Russian, and the other who did the opposite. In that environment, and it had to do with even between Poles and Ukrainians. Where did one language start? So in that kind of environment, there was no incentive on the language of Ukrainian. But the South was overwhelmingly Russian. Whatever they were by nationality, the Russians would say by nationality, they were Russian. And who knows after the war what will be where. But the last time I was in Ukraine, not in 1800, but like about 8 years ago, I heard Ukrainian spoken once. Kiev was an overwhelmingly Russian city. All the cities were Russian. Because, see, I've never wanted to be progressive, but if you did, then the language, Ukrainian, was considered a peasant language, like a poor language. You wouldn't want to speak it in a city. So it's not as, this question of language was really complex, but no, it was Russian. And it gave birth to Ukrainian nationalism, all the other nationalisms.
Thanks, Len. While you're talking about nationalisms, during that period, the construction of national mythologies, the kind of moment of primary acquisition, or this kind of focus on myths at the event or the time at which a people get attached to a territory,
yes,
becomes important, like the baptism of Clovis in France, or kind of other examples of similar events where a people comes to inhabit a territory.
Yes.
I'm wondering if Mennonites invested their moment of primary acquisition with any kind of mythological value in the time that we're looking at as they kind of matured in their self-understanding, or whether they themselves were more attracted to other nationalisms in certain ways. I guess I'm wondering about that moment of settlement itself and its meaning for this community as it develops over time.
Yeah. The question of identities was a complicated one. What I would say is, and I rely really on the work of many historians, because I'm in this weird situation of not having worked within the Mennonite settlements as such, right? But they don't identify, I was going to say with, I think the question of Mennonite identity, it's not national, Mennonite identity, is a very complex question, because you would think that would define it as religion. But from the point of settlement, they divide into a Flemish and Frisian. They divide into Flemish and Frisian. Then the Kleine Gemeinde. And the MB thing. And the MB thing ties in directly to the Lutherans, right? Baptists. And so I would say, in terms of those questions of identity, those aren't the questions they're asking. And if you look at John Staples' new book, where this correspondence with Cornies, they're not asking those questions at all. They're looking at economic development, and they're looking at piety, religious piety, which is what Mennonites get from the pietist movements. Ich bete an die Macht der Liebe. And so I would argue those things don't start to develop. They do start to develop in the late 19th century. And they start to develop, and that's when Mennonites begin to write the histories, P.M. Friesen's magnum opus, but the histories of Chotitza, a century after settlement, and you look at a lot of those histories of trying to find a Mennonite identity. And they do it because, in the same way as the question of what is Ukrainian emerges for Ukrainian urban intellectuals when they're supposedly in a Ukrainian city that's full of Russian speakers, because of the sudden imposition that they're outsiders by the state, that their language is suspicious. And they become reduced to Germans. And so what they begin to see in terms of identity, I would say, is funny. It's the first thing I looked at was for my MA, was at Mennonite Papers, Botschafter und Friedensstimme, in the start of the 20th century, is they begin to understand themselves as a little folkline. That was Harvey's big thing, Harvey Dick. And so I would say Mennonites define them, it's a very fluid way in which they come to understand themselves. James Urey, who worked on the formation of the MBs, said the only reason the MBs, Mennonite Brethren, again, if that doesn't mean anything, that's just grand, but the only reason the Mennonite Brethren become Mennonite is because of the hope of a military exemption. Because it becomes identity. So their whole drift, Urey, who has no bone to pick on with MB Kirchengemeinde whatsoever, that when they begin to argue for a military exemption, when it goes to Mennonites, then there is an incentive for a significant portion of the population to move away from their obvious attraction to Baptists and sort of stick with the others. So I don't know if you have a different sense of that from the work you've done, but I think it's a fascinating question, right, of identities. I want to look at that tomorrow, because I think what happens in the late Soviet era is Mennonites reclaim, so funny to have to say this, Mennonites reclaim a primary identity as Christians in the Soviet era. I would definitely say, I'm certain that was not the Mennonite identity in the Imperial era. And it couldn't be, because the poor were not going to church. They weren't really welcome, they were poor. I mentioned that already. And so, so this was a real tension within Mennonite villages, Mennonite society.
Yes, or three. Maybe just with an eye on that, maybe we will be able to continue this tomorrow, so maybe after this one question or two questions spent.
You made passing reference to the daughter colonies and the dynamics being a little different than what you were arguing for those.
Yes.
My dad's family was from Amtrak, so I don't know if that would... I'm just curious if you could say a little more about that.
So Amtrak is very different, because Amtrak, it's in, the very... Yeah, and the very word Amtrak tells you it's part of these Chumaki, it's on the trek, right? So these great, I would always tell students, globalization didn't just happen with Stephen Jobs, right? Like there was a movement for centuries. That's why this whole history is so rich to me. There was this whole movement of peoples that Mennonites were part of. And so Amtrak is very different, because I think their relations are relatively good. The problem that they have, though, with Amtrak, and especially the daughter colonies, the great massacres, Zagradovka, Eichenfeld, are daughter colonies. And what happens, the reason that becomes a problem, less so for Amtrak, where I don't think it's as volatile as it is in the lands of European Russia proper, is that those relations that Mennonites develop, they develop over about 80 years. But estate owners are the ones, when I wrote my first major book on the region, are the ones that I sort of don't have the greatest regard for. And they're the example of the white plantation owner is exactly the opposite. Russian estate owners are lazy. And what they do, and if you are from the Russian estate owning class, let me say I admire your people. But they're lazy. And they give the land away to peasants because they don't want to work it themselves. And then Mennonites will buy an entire estate. And the first thing Mennonites will say to peasants is, I'm sorry. We don't rent out our land. We work our land. You'll have to move. They often had set up villages. And they're the crunch. My father's father, these were massive estate owners in Scheinfeld, which Uri once told me is the foundation of Leamington and Vineland, right? Is that there's an immediate rub with the neighbors because they are removed from those lands. And I always say those Mennonites were as dastardly as we are when we buy land. They have our notion of land. And so it means that there is immediate tensions that will exist and poor relations. And so even Makhno is blamed on everything, but there's a reason to believe that in Eichenfeld, it's as much the local peasants that turn, once the chance is there, that turn on a daughter colony, as it is with the others. But Amtrak, I think those have a kind of a different, and I wouldn't want to say it's as aggressive, because the densities are much greater. And I'm happy to stay around. I'll maybe stay till the third denunciation, and then I'll sort of leave.
Is there one more question we could end on? Okay, over here.
You can ask me later, Vic. Yes, ma'am.
I am curious if you have in all of your studies found a reason for why, when I look at my ancestry back 9 generations to this stuff, we repeat the same names over and over and over and over again. My dad's name is John, my grandpa's name is Abram.
Yes.
My great-grandpa's name is Abram, his father was John, and it was Jacob, and then John, and then John, and
Yes.
then John.
Yes.
Like, yeah. Can you explain that?
Well, what lovely names. I would only be disappointed if your name was Abraham, Jacob, or John, is it? No. See, there are blessings. Oh, so I mean, like, names are cultural, and part of that culture, I'm married to someone, the most popular name in the world, Mary. That's suddenly, right? And because of religious reasons. And these were also intensely religious. And so those names kind of carried on. There was a particular way in which, in my background, because the father's name became the patronymic, so you would, as a woman, carry, you would carry the father's name in a feminized form. My mom was Anna Ivanovna. Anna, the daughter of John, is what her name was, Anna Ivanovna. And so I think there is a cultural element, but it is fascinating. And I think, quite frankly, because we live now at a time where we love the idea that there are no rules and traditions, I think that's considered cool. That is sort of breaking down in all sorts of ways. But I think it is a legacy of communities that were tied to the biblical record, where they read names that they wanted to see replicated. That would be my short answer.
Well, let's give Len another round of applause. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks very much. If you dare to come tomorrow, it'll be much more focused on a particular matter of the resurgence of religious faith under remarkably difficult situations.
It's a great part of the book, so I encourage everybody to come tomorrow and hear it. So thank you, drive safely, and we'll hopefully see you all tomorrow evening.